My dear friends, this week in the Torah sounds like today in America rather than 3,200 years ago in the Sinai wilderness. It's rebellion time in the Torah, two actually, one by 250 followers of a rebel named Korach, which is the name of this week's Torah portion, and a second battle against Moses and Aaron, led by Datan, Aviram, and On. It's not clear what the protests are really about, leaving lots of theories through the centuries by the rabbis as to the motive. Was it Korach's selfishness, opportunism? Was it his insecurity? Was it envy? The Torah is not clear. And if his cause was just, why did all of Korach's rebels get swallowed up by a giant earthquake as punishment? Subsequent rabbinic commentators, like the 12th century classical rabbinical homiletic collection on Midrashim, known as Midrash Rabbi, suggest that Korach won a base of his support by misleading them. To gin up the crowd, the rabbis in Numbers Rabbah say, Korach spent his nights going from house to house, tribe to tribe, making baseless and reckless accusations against Moses, changing the speech for each audience. The Midrash contends that Korach's underlying goal is always the same: to besmirch, bully, and sully Moses' good name. Several of the classic rabbinic commentators sympathize with some of the arguments Korach makes, but they point out that even where some of his positions make sense, his public shaming of the old guy Moses and his older brother Aaron too was irresponsible and just plain wrong. Korach, our rabbinic sages say, failed the leadership test by the way he humiliated, embarrassed, and degraded Moses, even mocking Moses over inconsistencies in the Torah. The renowned Nachmanides from Girona, Spain in the 1200s makes an additional claim that Korach and his followers, get this, distorted historical facts to inflame the people and win them over. In Nachmanides' eyes, Korach, Datan, Aviram, these rebels intentionally lied as stepping stones for personal advantage. I was studying this week's Torah portion instead of today's news, but these commentaries and the next one speak to this moment as much as biblical times. Because Korach and the rebels took advantage of the confusion and fears of the people, perverting the truth and misleading them, the earth swallowed them up and they were punished. In Judaism, disagreement is not only welcomed but encouraged. You know the joke, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. But our tradition does differentiate between just and unjust disputes. A just or heavenly dispute, l'shem shamayim, is when the disagreement, the rabbis say, is over a good cause, where the disagreement is about how to do the greatest good, which way is better to help the most people. An unjust dispute, literally called a selfish dispute, say the rabbis, is one that is pursued for self-centered reasons, they say, self-seeking reasons, and the chief example of selfish, say the rabbis, is this week's Korach and his selfish aims. So rabbi after rabbi through the centuries makes compelling arguments about Korach's egocentric way of whipping up the crowd, putting down Moses publicly, while displaying no fundamental regard for the people, just a greedy attempt to dominate Moses. Now, one word I did not find in the classic rabbinic commentators about Korach's threat is what I believe to be the most pressing issue of our time. Not just regarding the COVID public health disasters, and not just police brutality. I believe it's the most pressing issue of our time with society as a whole. And it is this: we are losing a basic sense of empathy for other human beings. In an open letter to her fellow white Christians, Reverend Margaret Renkel writes, and I quote, "Make yourself look in video after video the most casual brutality and unconcern with people who are bleeding on the ground or screaming in pain. Study the air of perfect nonchalance on the officer's face as he kneels on the neck of George Floyd," she says. "Register the blithe and casual indifference in the officer's posture, the way he puts his hands in his pocket as though he were just walking along the street on a sunny summer day. Nothing in his whole body suggests concern. He is not the least bit troubled by taking another human life. We created Derek Chauvin," the Reverend continues, "not just police brutality, but every single aspect of our criminal justice system," she adds, "is permeated by racism. Too many Christians continue to vote for so-called law and order, failing to notice that more cops and more weapons and more prisons have done exactly nothing to make us all safer, failing to notice that they've instead endangered all Americans, Black people most of all." Whether or not the officers who killed or stood by as George Floyd, whether or not they're convicted is not my issue. Thinking of Korach and what he was trying to drum up, my issue is what's happening to all of us because of what's become acceptable when it comes to the way we act like Korach, according to the rabbis, and the way we treat each other, whether we are citizens or policemen. The essential missing piece, not only with Korach and some policemen, but with too many of the rest of us, including thousands of unmasked white college kids in Arizona this week, shoulder to shoulder, egging on racist rants against Asian people and enjoying it. The essential missing piece is empathy and the recognition of the basic humanity of all humans, whether they are a celebrity like Moses or an Asian stranger. It's not just the Korach type of demagogic leader who is dangerous. It's the gradual erosion of empathy and basic regard for other human beings, especially those who look, love, and live different than you or me. America, Memphis, Israel, the world needs a dose of radical empathy in the face of today's Korachs. I once read that empathy is different than pity, which is when you're looking down on someone and feeling sorry for them. Empathy is also different than sympathy, which is when you're looking across at someone and feeling bad for them. Empathy means getting inside of the other person and trying to imagine their reality, looking at their situation, and not say, what would I do if I were in their position, but rather, why are they doing what they're doing from the perspective of what they've had to endure, survive, or experience? Most of us have been blessed with positive childhoods devoid of violence. But when you witness the violent deaths my Memphis minister friends' congregants and their children have survived, when you see your father or mother brutalized by anyone, the trauma lasts a lifetime. We can't change the past, but we can create a more caring future in which we feel for others rather than slander people callously. Mocking old man Moses, as the rabbi saw Korach and his rebels doing, is cruel, heartless, insensitive. 3,200 years later in America, we are on the precipice of something even worse than an absence of basic decency. We are becoming numb to a simple concern for another human being's life and allowing a civilized society to become a Darwinist jungle where the healthy survive, the winners survive, and others fall behind and die. A social order that is animalistic and about me, not Judaism's insistence on every individual's moral obligation to protect others. We are 4 months into the COVID pandemic, and today was the first day 40,000 Americans became infected. Never been higher. There are no more ICU beds available in cities like Houston. 20-somethings in Florida spreading the virus, where their mild cases are infecting people who have to work. Disproportionately people of color, least likely to survive, not to mention the ones without masks, whose older relatives and friends have higher morbidity and mortality rates from the ongoing COVID spread, the effects of which we won't even know until a month from now what happened today. The looking out for oneself and reckless Korach behavior met the missing piece needed, radical empathy, a few nights ago in Scottsdale. Taking the stage at an anti-mask rally in Scottsdale, a councilman appeared in a black face mask, and then, in a monotone voice, this Korach-like leader demonstrated the difference between a holy dispute and one which is unjust and only reinforces insensitivity and lack of concern for another human being's life. This elected official at an anti-mask rally, he was white, said into the microphone through his mask, "I can't breathe." He said it again louder, "I can't breathe," echoing the dying words of the unarmed George Floyd. Words which are the peaceful rallying cry for sensible police reform. The councilman then ripped off the mask gleefully, rolled his eyes as the crowd cheered and applauded. "Insanity," he said, "of the mask mandate." Mocking the last words of a man named George Floyd who was murdered is beyond callous. But where I believe a moral God weeps is in the choice of the appalling crowd to applaud, or you or me to just let it go. Where a moral God weeps is when you are given the power to save a human life with a mask, then use a dying man's words to encourage people to kill others by not wearing a mask. That's the beginning of the end of the empathy, no matter what your politics, religion, or material welfare says Judaism. In preparatory reading material for a panel I was on 2 days ago with Memphis Police Director Mike Rawlings, UT College of Medicine Dean Scott Strom, and other key UT medical faculty, thanks to Doctors Alpha Stewart and Jean Jemison, I want to share with you in my reading a great image and prescription in how each of us should address the hatred, lack of empathy, tolerance of the Korachs, injustice all around us. It has to do with dental hygiene philosophy. To paraphrase the writer Jay Smoot, we have to stop thinking of prejudice or practicing empathy the way we think about our tonsils or our implants. With tonsils and implants, you get them removed or you put them in and that's it. You don't have to worry about them again. Or put differently, if we just pass one anti-chokehold bill or get AK-47 weapons of mass killing to quiet parents down whose kids were victims of gun violence, or if we all just attend one sensitivity training on undoing racism, or if we can just get the economy open regardless of the science, if we could just do one thing, then we're done. But the issues that define the character of a society, as we learn from Korach, and I hope we're all learning now, like how we dismantle systemic racism or practicing empathy, is not like a one-time tonsillectomy. It's more like brushing or flossing your teeth. You personally have to look at your own reflection in the mirror and brush and floss every day. If you don't, the plaque will build up and cause all sorts of health problems, not only in your gums, but all over your body. Professor Jelani Cobb, the Ira Lippman Chair at Columbia University, he summed up where we are as a society this way before I close. He said, the systemic inequalities between Black and white Americans are documented not only with COVID, but in rates of virtually all diseases, in morbidity, infant mortality, unemployment, which attest that although race may be a biological fiction, its reality is seen in what is likely to happen in people's lives. The more than 40 million people of African descent who live in the United States recognize this reality, but it is largely invisible in the lives of white Americans. Think back to how men, upon seeing the scroll of Me Too testimonies, asked their wives, daughters, sisters, co-workers, is it really that bad? I mean, I heard there were a few men who mistreated and attacked women sexually, but is it really that bad? Men asked. The shock of revelation among white people in the wake of the George Floyd video is itself a kind of inequality, because it's a barometer of the extent to which one group of Americans with white skin have moved through life largely free from the burden of such terrible knowledge, which Jews of color in our own congregation at Temple have lived with all their lives. For over 20 summers, and this was the week for 2020, I speak to high school leaders from the Washington, D.C. area who are a part of Operation Understanding DC, or OUDC. And following my talk, I always ask them to ask me questions. And then I ask them questions. I asked these gifted youth leaders just 2 days ago via Zoom. Of course, they weren't able to make it here this year. I asked them what people wrongly assume about them. And one amazing young person named Emma, she's at the top community Jewish day school in the DC area. She was seconded by another African-American Jewish girl at the top of her public high school in Bethesda. These radiant young women were both Black, among the only Black students in their elite high school classes. And they shared with me how assumptions were immediately made about their academic potential, their home life, their ability, simply because they were Black, even if they ended up being at the top of their classes, these Jewish girls, and living in the same big houses that their white peers did. One of the girls said, "Rabbi, the issue isn't academics or material class. We are relatively well off, and I'm doing just fine in my AP classes. The issue is race, even for a Black Jew as privileged as me." I just listened. How healing it would be if more white Americans listened to Black Americans. If they did, what they would hear is a deep and excruciating agony as these protests post-George Floyd abate and the number of COVID cases all over the United States continues to rise. The antidote to Korach, the antidote to indifference, meanness, and cruelty, the way to bring back empathy, is to remember that when the day is done, we are how we treat each other and nothing more.